special guests, Anne Slaw and her son, Andrew, who are from another organization. And I'm going to let me turn it over to them kind of quickly, just to let them talk about what their organization does. And we're sort of here celebrating and raising awareness about the dysautonomia that they focus on. Obviously, Dysautonomia International does a lot of stuff with POTS and autoimmune autonomic ganglionopathy and syncope, but familial dysautonomia is a very rare type of dysautonomia, and Anne and Andrew are our experts on that tonight. So let me pass it over to you guys.
Well, hello, thank you, and thank you, Lauren, for putting this together and getting the word out. I think that's great. My name is Anne Slaw, and I am both mom to Andrew, who has familial dysautonomia, and also president of Familial Dysautonomia NOW Foundation. Andrew.
Yeah, you know, with FD, it's, you know, we just kind of wanted to kind of introduce everyone to like what, you know, what it is, you know, what it's like to have it, and kind of talk about, you know, our organization and what we do to kind of help the FD community and stuff like that.
Yeah. Well, we're so glad to have you here. So for those who are tuned into the webinar and for those who might be listening in on Facebook, let's talk about, so the name familial dysautonomia obviously gives people a hint that the thing that causes it or whatever can run in families, but other types of dysautonomia can run in families too. So can you tell us a little bit about how does FD run in families? How, you know, what makes it familial?
Sure. And, you know, I think this is where our organizations kind of cross over, because we get a lot of phone calls from people who believe that they have familial dysautonomia. And in fact, they have a more common form of dysautonomia. But because they've heard that maybe someone in their family also is having autonomic symptoms, their doctor has diagnosed them with dysautonomia, they automatically jump to and assume that they have familial dysautonomia. Familial dysautonomia is probably the most rare and also the most severe form of dysautonomia. It's so different. Well, there's crossover, but it's extremely different than dysautonomia in that it is present at birth. So if a baby is born and they are having difficulty, failure to thrive, failure to suck, very low tone, things that are showing up right away, it is more likely that that person has familial dysautonomia. If there is an Ashkenazi background, it is more likely that they have familial dysautonomia. And not everybody really knows their genetic makeup, so that can get tricky.
Yeah. But for people who might not know what Ashkenazi means, it's can you give a little more explanation on that? I think we're like, you know, we know what this is, but I'm always assuming an audience is international and, you know, terms are different in different places.
Sure, of course. So in the Jewish world, speaking very, very broadly, there are kind of two sectors. There's the Ashkenazi Jewish population and there's the Sephardic population. The Ashkenazi population is typically has its roots in Eastern Europe. Sephardic more Israeli. So those are kind of the two differences there.
So do people with FD typically have two parents with Ashkenazi ancestry, right?
Yes, that's correct. So my background, my family heritage comes from kind of the Russian area, as does my husband's. And so we are both of Ashkenazi descent. And that is what we typically see in the world of familial dysautonomia.
Yeah. So can you tell us a little bit about, so people with FD have like very severe dysautonomia, sort of neurological problems from the time that they're a baby.
Yes.
How does if you're a parent of a very young child who's having a lot of problems, and how does a doctor screen for this in a child? Are there specific tests that doctors would run?
Yes, there is a specific test for that. In addition to carrier tests, so there's a blood test to see if you even carry the mutation for FD, as well as a blood test for those that have FD. There's a way to verify that through blood as well.
So it's like a specific genetic marker, or a few. I think there might be a few different ones, but they're very closely related, different genetic markers, right?
Yeah, there's one primary mutation, and then there's like a secondary, but it's not really that popular, if you will, or that common. Yeah.
So could you tell us the gene that has this mutation, what is that gene responsible for? Like, how does that gene difference end up causing the symptoms of FD?
So what the gene does is it just disrupts the autonomic nervous system. And basically those with FD have half the neurons, half the power in their autonomic system than someone without FD. So that translates, and I have to say, as a parent of somebody with FD, even just to remember, there's 20 different symptoms of FD. Just to share with you, so everyone knows, as we talked about in the beginning, the initial, at birth, failure to thrive, often being fed through an NG tube. As the child continues to grow, you will see developmental delays,
Low pain tolerance.
low pain tolerance. Well, no pain. There's no pain.
Difficulty regulating temperatures, difficulty gaining weight, low stamina, low tear production, kind of, so those are, some of the, very basic ones.
Dry eyes, corneal abrasion, absence of overflow tears, as you talked about, unstable blood pressure, unstable heart rate, scoliosis is very common, as is kyphosis, which is kind of a leaning over. And I think probably one of the most difficult things with FD is the hypertensive crisis.
What can you tell us a little bit about like what are the things that can trigger that, and what is it, what happens when people have like an autonomic crisis or a hypertensive crisis with FD?
Mostly,
You're the guy.
Through like 25 years of my own research. It's been, food, in some foods, there's a chemical, I think, called tyramine. And a lot of these, and that's kind of been like aged, highly processed foods as examples. And these can cause kind of trigger a crisis, which kind of is high blood pressure, high heart rate, retching, I don't recommend it to anyone.
It doesn't sound like it's fun.
Kind of a fun time. But you know, and because of research and stuff, these crises, you know, they've gotten less sporadic, you know, more now that we kind of know more what causes them, and they're not as intense. So, you know, which is, you know, very cool. I think.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
just, you know, Andrew, from 0 to 10, he was in the hospital back and forth. So much of his childhood, at least 30 hospitalizations, some of which lasted quite some time. One hospitalization was 6 months. So the hypertensive crises, as Andrew mentioned, can be triggered by pyramine, which is in foods, aged foods. Illness, so like a severe illness can also cause fever, can cause a hypertensive crisis. And then there's sometimes, and I'm sure your people listening can, as well as you, Lauren, can identify with this. Sometimes you just don't know. You know, there's kind of that frustration of, why am I feeling off today?
Yeah, your autonomic nervous system just decided to go on its own vacation.
Exactly. Yes, exactly.
Without you. So your foundation has funded some research with some researchers here in New York. I would love to learn more about that and let the other community members learn from, you know, I was fascinated when I learned about the work you guys were funding and what the researchers are doing. You want to tell us a little bit about it? It's really, I think, an innovative way to treat very specific genetic disorders, you know, and I love that you're doing it. So I'll stop talking about it and I'll let you talk about it.
Well, we're just as excited about it as you are. You know, prior to this research, FD was treated per symptom. So, and as I mentioned, I have to even read all the symptoms because I can't remember them all. That's a lot of things to manage if you're just going symptom by symptom by symptom. Fortunately, a researcher stepped forward, Dr. Barish-Rubin, who's at Fordham at the Laboratory for Familial Dysautonomia Research, along with Dr. Sylvia Anderson, and they were able to identify the mutation that causes FD, and in doing so, really made a pledge to find quick, immediate, accessible, affordable treatments, really dipping into the nutraceutical world, you know, things that you can just go to the grocery store and take off the shelf. And instead of treating the condition symptom by symptom, to really look for something on that shelf that's right there that's going to treat the root cause of what is driving familial dysautonomia. How do we begin to correct that mutation and the effects of that mutation? So in doing so, I do have to tell the story of when Andrew was 10 and he was in the hospital. This one always gets me, sorry. And
you're allowed.
He was 6 months in. The doctors kind of threw up their hands and said, we don't know what to do. He was having 1 to 3 of these autonomic crises per day. And it was just, I mean, there are really no words, you know, they're basically saying, we don't know what to do and, you know, plan accordingly. Dr. Rubin had discovered something called tocotrienol, which is a form of vitamin E. And he said, I would like you to take some tocotrienol, draw it up with a syringe. And you're going to have to take a toothpick and squeeze it out and draw it up. And then you're going to have to put it in, mix it with a little olive oil. And then you're going to have to put it into Andrew's G tube. And that is going to help him. And I said, are you insane? Are you crazy? What are you saying? But of course, we did it, you know, because we did it. We absolutely trusted him. And we kept a log of how many crises Andrew was having from that day forward, and the intensity. So not just the number and the intensity of those crises. And over a 2-week period, both began to happily decline. And at the end of 2 weeks, Andrew sat up in bed and said, I'm hungry. And we all just started bawling. The nurses came in, they were crying. The doctors were saying, absent any other treatment changes, we can only assume that the tocotrienols is what caused this turnaround. So Andrew was discharged 3 days later. And that kind of began this whole amazing journey. And the tocotrienols, amazing what came next with the genesine, with EGCG. These are obviously all listed on the website, www.ftnow.org. But there are several nutraceuticals that all work synergistically to help the autonomic system really begin working more efficiently. And we have definitely seen that.
Can you, for our listeners, can you explain what is a nutraceutical and how is it different than a pharmaceutical?
A great question. So a nutraceutical is kind of a fancy name for supplement. And what's different about Dr. Rubin and Dr. Anderson is, you know, because supplements, people, they're not regulated, and you know, but every single supplement, aka nutraceutical, aka treatment, they take a look at the lots that are coming through, and they make sure that the quality from lot to lot is the same, so that the FD population is assured that if there is something that a company has decided to switch up, they're on top of that.
Yeah. When you first told me about this, I wasn't really skeptical, but I was more like, is this science-based? You know, and it wasn't a doubting, because I think, you know, Andrew, you're an adult, you know your own body, you know what's helping you. And I feel like patient knowledge is real, you know, but is it repeatable? Is it in journal articles and stuff like that? So I did a little digging on my own, and then you introduced me to the researchers and we had a good chat. And I was just fascinated because I really think that it is truly evidence-based medicine. And I wish we had doctors doing this kind of stuff for other types of dysautonomia. So the treatments you have mentioned, these are very precisely targeted towards the genetic problem that FD causes, that FD is, and what it's doing to the nerves. So I wouldn't, people who are listening, I wouldn't assume, because you have a different type of dysautonomia, that these are somehow going to be helpful for you, because you have a very different cause of your dysautonomia. But I love the concept that we can take substances in nature that we can very much tailor to the specific biology of what's going wrong in this person's nervous system, and try to find substances, whether it's in nature or not, you know, like what is the compound that will help this molecule work the right way we want it to, you know. And I think you have researchers doing that for FD, which is wonderful. So let's talk a little bit more about you know, Andrew, from your perspective, you know, what do you want everybody to know about FD?
Well, you know, I would say if I could describe kind of life with FD in a word, it would be kind of unstable, because, you know, our people with FD, our bodies kind of, they're kind of, it's hard to stabilize kind of normal everyday functions and stuff like that, you know. So and you know, with that, you can imagine come some anxiety and stuff like that. That's, you know, that's its own struggle. But you know, but I would also like to say that with the research and treatments, things have definitely improved and gotten better over the years, and you know, which is pretty amazing.
Yeah. Well, I always think it's interesting. You know, I have a different type of dysautonomia, but very often when if I go to a new doctor, they might have learned about FD in medical school, because it's actually the first type of dysautonomia that was described. Like, I think it was Bradbury and Eggleston. I'm going to get the names wrong, and the autonomic neurologists listening are probably going to yell at me for getting the names wrong, but it was originally described by two neurologists a very long time ago, right?
Riley Day.
Huh?
And
Riley Day.
Riley Day.
Bradbury Eggleston was a type of autonomic failure, and I can't remember which one. But anyways, it was described a while ago, and for a long time, that was the only type of dysautonomia in the medical textbooks. And that's what a lot of doctors, especially older doctors, that's what they learned. And they were told it's very, very rare. And, you know, so then when they see a teenage girl with sort of lightheadedness and tachycardia, they're like, oh, you know, you can't have dysautonomia. You don't have this very severe FD stuff, you know, and they would sort of dismiss and say, you know, that the other person doesn't have dysautonomia. But now we have a much larger research field, still pretty small field in general, but we now know there's many different types of dysautonomia, and many of them run in the family. You know, we have pretty much every type of dysautonomia seems to have some kind of, you know, inheritance pattern, although we don't have specific genes other than FD. There aren't really specific genes identified for most of the other types of dysautonomia at this point. So tell me a little bit more about, you know, how many people have FD, and how many, you know, I've heard that a lot of people who have it live in the New York area, or live in Tel Aviv, or live in Chicago, because there's so few doctors that really know how to help these patients, right?
It really comes down to where's your major Jewish population living. So you've got there's about 300 people with FD living today, 600 approximately diagnosed, and a third of those folks live in New York, big Jewish population. A third of those folks live in Israel, big Jewish population. And then the third of us, which kind of we fall into, are like scattered to the winds and kind of fall all over the world.
Yeah. So it's lots, you know, 300 people having a disease is just like ultra rare disease, right?
Yes.
But, because it can be so severe, I think that it's so important that pediatricians and parents know about this, so that, you know, let me ask, do you guys see in the FD population, are there diagnostic delays? Are there people who don't find out for years, or do they generally pick it up when the baby's quite young?
That's a great question. So Andrew was diagnosed at age 4. And it kind of just depends on each individual case. Most are diagnosed in the early years, just because the symptoms are pretty dramatic. But we have had calls where somebody who's in their 20s has just been diagnosed with FD, which is very, very unusual. Typically, their symptoms are a little milder, But if you dig deeper, you learn that all their symptoms began at birth. And that's really critical. And that usually there's that Ashkenazi, so you can piece it together. But I would say the vast majority of people with FD, because of the severity of symptoms, are typically diagnosed in the early years.
Yeah. So are there any differences? And, a lot of genetic diseases, like males will have it worse or females will have it worse. Are there any like sex differences in FD, or does everybody kind of have it equally bad?
None that I'm aware of. The many families that we know, and it's an equal opportunity condition.
Yeah. Equal opportunity offender, right?
Yes, yes, absolutely.
So do kids who have FD, are they typically able to go to school, or do they have to do homeschooling, or, are there educational challenges?
There are, it's kind of a mishmash. I would say many get through school.
I went to Columbia for I forget how many years, but Columbia, downtown Chicago.
Graduated college.
Yes.
We're talking to a college graduate here.
Yep.
Which is awesome. During the early years, Andrew was in special ed, mostly because of medical absences. So there was a lot of traction, and then had to go to the hospital, and then gained some momentum, and then had to go to the hospital. So there was a lot of resource services, that were set up to kind of catch up and make sure that that you be there, academically.
It's I think that any complex chronic illness, and particularly genetic disorders that start when you're really young, I think it's really a challenge to make sure that the student gets, fair treatment from the schools and all the opportunities that they can possibly benefit from. And I think that's hard, not just probably for FD families, but for anybody with a young kid who has very intense medical needs, to try to make their childhood as normal as possible, to have them socialize in school and learn their reading, writing, and arithmetic, But I'm so glad that you were able to do that. And so you had told me last time we chatted, you told me about sort of like a side hustle, like you got a job, you're doing like graphic design stuff. Can you tell us a little bit about that, and how that's going?
A while ago I was like looking for a job, and because of kind of the health and the life I have, it was kind of hard to find like a 9-to-5 kind of job. So I was like, okay, you know what, maybe it's time. I put things kind of into my own hands. So I started a business called Slaw Art, where it's art, drawing, and I have an online shop, and I do commission work, and it's been very interesting and very fulfilling too.
Yeah. What's the website link again?
I don't have a website, but the link to the shop, it's the website where my shop is called Threadless. You can find kind of my stuff there, and get a bunch of cool stuff with my art on it.
Yeah, I thought it was pretty cool stuff.
Yeah.
So for FD families, what are the type of resources that FD now offers? Because whenever whenever Dysautonomia International gets an FD family, we direct them to you guys because you really have the experience with this very specific patient population. And we're not trying to reinvent the wheel. Somebody's already doing a great job for the FD folks. And it's likewise when people have multiple system atrophy, which is another very sort of severe and in the older dysautonomia patients, there's the MSA coalition. So we send MSA families to them. And, we kind of get stuck with the not pediatric and the not elderly, kind of the everyone in the middle, which is the more common types of dysautonomia, which is kind of unusual that the rarer types are in younger people and in much older people, but there's a lot of people stuck in the sandwich in the middle. So, but tell us about, what are the resources that FD Now offers to FD families?
Well, our main primary laser focus is finding the as many treatments as possible to help the autonomic system to increase stability. So that is the focus. The other thing that, especially because FD and really so many of the autonomic diagnoses can feel very isolating, is Dr. Rubin is available 24/7 to talk to anybody about familial dysautonomia and to work very closely with any medical team to try and round out the picture so that the doctor understands biologically what's going on in that person's system. And he is an extremely critical resource for people with familial dysautonomia.
No, I'm sure it's very scary and confusing when you're first getting diagnosed, and especially if you're a young child, you might not really understand what's going on yet, but your parents certainly do and are probably very worried and looking for someone to help guide that. So I'm really glad that you can do that for people and that you have great researchers on the case.
Yeah, we're really, in it heart and soul.
Yeah. So something that we've been trying to do as an organization is trying to get more federal research funding from the National Institutes of Health to support autonomic disorders research as a whole. Because even though FD and things like POTS or AAG, an autoimmune autonomic ganglionopathy, these are very different mechanisms that cause autonomic disease. But at the end of the day, it is the same kind of small community of researchers that study these patients. And so from my mind, if Vanderbilt's Autonomic Lab gets a grant to study FD, that's great, because that's more support for that lab that has good autonomic doctors and they're training other doctors. And I do think if you learn something about one autonomic disease, it usually has some knowledge relevance to the other diseases as well. And sort of building the overall knowledge of how the autonomic nervous system works and how it interacts with all of the different bodily systems and organs and regulatory mechanisms and roles it plays. I mean, I won't say who, but I had conversations with a very, very well-known, highly respected, very senior autonomic neurologist. I had found some pretty cool basic science papers on norepinephrine's role in regulating iron metabolism, like sort of iron transit through the body. And our POTS patients often have low iron stores or iron storage problems. So
yes, those with FD.
Really?
Yeah.
Something on our webinar.
Yes. Yes.
I pitched the idea to this very senior researcher that maybe we should study the role of the abnormal norepinephrine in POTS patients as maybe a driver of this iron problem. And can we fix the iron problem by fixing the norepinephrine problem? Like kind of looking at the mechanisms that cause these things. And this very, very, very senior researcher was like, wow, I had no idea that norepinephrine had an iron role. Like they just, and it's not because they're not like a brilliant person, it's just, it regulates the autonomic nervous system, just regulates so much stuff, right? And I think most, even the really, really great doctors haven't figured it all out yet. And I like part of our role is also your role, supporting researchers in the autonomic field to try to help them get more resources so they can do more for our patient communities. And I think that's, our shared mission that we have with you guys. Your researchers are in some ways more advanced than the other types of dysautonomia, probably because FD is so severe that probably more effort has gone into that. Understandably, like some other types of dysautonomia are more common, but they're not fatal. So there's maybe not as many people as kind of interested in trying to figure it out and help. But it's growing. I think the whole field is growing a little bit. And so, Andrew, did you ever have an experience where, so I don't know if this happens with FD when you're younger, but did you ever have an experience where you see a new doctor and they kind of just were like, what do you have? Like they just didn't get it at all? Did you ever face that?
I'm sure. I can't really remember.
I can.
Yes. Yeah.
Oh yes. Oh yes. There's a lot of educating that goes on. And I have to say, when talking to a doctor who kind of has that deer in the headlights, we love the doctors that say, and that are just honest, I don't know about this condition, but I would love to learn. And we say,
dysautonomia are more common. Uh-oh, I echoed my own voice back. That's horrible. Sorry if you heard that. I was looking at the questions on the Facebook page to see if there were questions for us.
Okay.
Sorry, keep going.
Oh, sure. So, the doctors that we love are the ones that, they state their own ignorance. I don't know, but I'm willing to learn. And so you combine their medical knowledge, we combine our information about familial dysautonomia, you roll in the research information and the researcher, and you get this wonderful synergy that often takes place. And so the level of understanding is raised. The doctors that scare me the most are the ones that that think they know everything. Or the ones that, simply don't care to know anything.
Yeah. What are there
and we've run into them all.
Yeah, I was gonna say, is there sort of knowledge amongst the Ashkenazi community that this is something that can happen? Like, is there an awareness amongst like rabbis and temples that serve this population that this is something that sometimes shows up in the community?
Absolutely. And through our efforts, we were able to ensure that OBGYNs know, as a standard of practice, when they're consulting with a couple, that they shall tell them about familial dysautonomia, much like they would mention Tay-Sachs or other Ashkenazi Jewish conditions, once they know the family's background. So, prevalence obviously has gone down because of that, which is great. But definitely in the Ashkenazi community as a whole, outside the medical community, yes, there absolutely is an awareness that these conditions exist and that testing is imperative.
Yeah. So I'm always think about, like, historically, if people had stuff like this, they just wouldn't get help. And it makes me so sad to think about that. But I wonder, like, when someday in the future, someone's going to be having a webinar, or probably some other technology that's way cooler than Zoom. But and they'll be thinking of us, and they'll say, "Wow, they didn't really know much back then," you know. And
Right.
In the future, you know, I hope that there's a lot more advancement. And I had a doctor on Long Island who I saw for a POTS, which is, you know, POTS is, it certainly doesn't feel mild to people who have it, but relative to FD, it is a milder form of autonomic dysfunction. So people don't get mad at me for saying that. It's just the reality is that as bad as your POTS is, FD is more severe, right? But this doctor on Long Island said to me, when I told him I had POTS, he goes, "Oh, I have another dysautonomia patient." And I said, "Oh, like POTS?" And he said, "No, this patient has FD." And I said, "Oh, wow, that's really rare." He said, "Yeah." And he's 55. And this was a big deal because historically, like a long time ago, right, people didn't always live a long time with FD,
Right.
but that's really improving now. And, you know, I don't want to say anything upsetting, but I'm like super, you know, happy that that is something that I think people can have hope for, that there's such improvement in treatment that, you know, people are living much longer, like hopefully much better lives. So
Agreed. And, you know, Andrew's, we've obviously been very candid in our home. We're very open. And, you know, when Andrew was diagnosed at age 4, we were told that he'd be gone by age 10, which we found completely unacceptable. And thank goodness we did.
yes.
And Andrew is 30 years old this past April. So yeah.
I think that there's nothing like feisty parents to get things done, right? And then they have a feisty kid on top of it. But I see this in other dysautonomia families who are offered very little hope by doctors or not really supported the way they should be. And there's nothing like, you know, like our best volunteers or POTS moms, like people who just kind of are like, "Nope, we don't accept this for our kids. We're going to make it better." So I love that your family has done that, and helping so many other FD families along the way. It's pretty awesome. So we can take some questions in the Q&A. So let's see if we have any questions coming in on our Facebook feed or in our Q&A. So let's see. Somebody's saying, "Oh, so here's a question. Do people with FD have insulin regulation issues sometimes?"
Really? No, we haven't really seen that. We have lots of other things, but no.
Oh, if you want to talk about other things, we can. I was just,
we covered those.
Yeah.
But no, I don't think that that's something that's kind of in our world.
in the orbit. Yeah. I think the person was asking because there's some newer research in POTS showing that the autonomic nervous system is sort of dysregulating the insulin sort of glucose mechanisms. And it wouldn't be surprising to find that in some other types of just, you know, some other autonomic problems. So do people with FD generally have things like, when you're not having a hypertensive crisis, do you tend to be low blood pressure leaning?
Yeah. Yes, but you know, even that, it can be kind of unstable. Like sometimes when we go to like the doctor, that like when the nurse checks, we have to like let her know that it's normally, you know.
It's normally low.
Yeah.
So like 60/40 is not unusual. Andrew, having now sat here, you know, for a while, when he gets up, he will definitely feel that, you know, orthostatic dysfunction, and may get dizzy. His pupils might dilate. He may need to crouch down for about 30 seconds and then re-regulate. That happens a lot with car rides too, long car rides.
Yeah, you know, usually I need to get something eat or drink to kind of balance things out.
Yeah.
Yeah. I do the crouch down thing too. I don't have FD, but I pretend I'm tying my shoelaces fairly often in public. So, and the crouching down usually saves me from the faint, but the getting up part is still never fun because it's like whoosh.
Whoa, yeah.
But
And do your pupils dilate as well? Have you ever looked at your pupils?
so
Get blurry?
so my dysautonomia is caused by an autoimmune disease.
Hmm.
And before it was treated, I always had unevenly dilated pupils or sluggish reaction to when they shine the light in your eye, it's supposed to constrict a certain speed, and mine was
Same with Andrew.
a
Slow.
little off. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, but my autoimmune treatment helped that a lot. And now I still have some issues, but I'm more stable than less stable, if that makes
Okay.
sense. Like
Sure,
before treatment, I was in the hospital a lot too. So I think, a lot of people with different types of dysautonomia there are similar symptoms, because when the autonomic nervous system is disturbed, it causes a certain set of symptoms, but they can differ in severity, and they can differ in how many of those things you're having at once. And obviously, probably the biggest difference is the cause of the problem, right? So for example, like people with diabetes can get diabetic autonomic neuropathy that's very, very, very severe, right? But then other people with diabetes don't have any autonomic neuropathy. So I think the dysautonomia world as a whole is a big spectrum of severity. And even if you have the mildest form of it, it can feel so overwhelmingly debilitating. So I sort of think of us all as we're all in one boat, and we need to row in the same direction, whether the cause is genetic or metabolic or immune, or a lot of people have a dysautonomia diagnosed and they don't know why. That's got to be incredibly frustrating to not know why you have it, and to just sort of at least, like, if you know the why, like with the doctors you guys work with at Fordham, like, the why, and then they can develop treatments to target the specific reason, the mechanisms. So there's a lot of people with dysautonomia that we don't know what's causing it. And so how can they ever get to the mechanistic treatment?
Exactly.
Basically, all they're left with is symptomatic treatment, which I'm sure
Yes.
you use too, but
Yes.
it's only so effective, it only does so much. So yeah, let's see if we have any other questions. I think there were some FD families that might have tuned into the Zoom broadcast. If there are anyone on there who want to ask, on the Zoom tool, you can type into the Q&A and ask some questions if you'd like to. And for those of you watching on Facebook, you can type some questions into the comments underneath that on Facebook. So here's a question: aren't most cases undiagnosed as to the cause? So that isn't specific to an FD question. That's about dysautonomia as a whole. And I would say we actually don't have a really good handle on the epidemiology of this. We know that 25% of diabetics get dysautonomic neuropathy from diabetes. We know that a subset of people with about 65% of Parkinson's patients get autonomic neuropathy and autonomic problems. So that's a lot of people. A very large subset of Sjogren's syndrome patients, which is an autoimmune disease that affects about 4 million Americans. Most of them have some degree, they have a lack of tears and lack of saliva. Kind of sounds familiar, right? So Sjogren's is considered a rheumatological condition, but that's my cause of dysautonomia. And I actually view it as a neurological disorder that happens to cause joint pain in some people, but it's really the dry eyes and dry mouth that Sjogren's is famous for is an autonomic problem at the root, So let's see. Oh, here's a good one. Here's a question for Andrew. Do you have any tips for explaining dysautonomia to people who don't understand what it is, like people in the community or neighbors or nosy relatives?
Basically I would describe it kind of, everything, like my system is kind of like at 50%, you know. And to, I kind of go back to describing it as kind of just overall unstable, being unstable, you know, physically.
Yeah, and I think Andrew, even in first grade, he got up in front of his class and he had written and illustrated a book on what is FD. And so he spoke directly to his classmates, like, if you see that, you know, I'm eating and my face gets red, don't worry. My blood pressure might be going up. If you see that I'm crouching down on the floor, don't worry, it just means my blood pressure is low. So he actually went through all the different symptoms as a first grader and explained it, and everybody then was like, oh, okay, you know, and moved on with their day. But I thought that was really, really helpful. And it's hard when you have a condition that is so involved internally and is not as obvious externally. So it really is hard to explain, especially with so many different symptoms.
Yeah.
But I think you're right. It's kind of like your autonomic nervous system, which is in charge of everything that your body does automatically, that you don't think about. Blood pressure, heart rate. None of us are sitting here thinking about our blood pressure or our heart rate.
We're a dysautonomia audience, so maybe we are. But
I take that back. My apologies.
No,
Or digesting food, you know, everything in your body is just on automatic pilot that, you know, Andrew said it is running at about half speed. And yeah.
So we're starting to get more questions now. So here's I got one on Facebook and one in the Zoom chat about, so people are asking, do you have other family members who have FD? And in the FD community, do you see like multi-generational FD, or is it usually just sort of like one person in the family? Because it, you know, the term familial makes it sound like grandma had it and mom had it and now the son has it. Is that how it works, or is it a little different than that?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's not hereditary like that.
No. So it's there are some families where we'll see, you know, a brother and maybe an uncle, but that's pretty rare to see that. And what was the other part of your question?
Oh, it was just, you know, do multiple relatives have this in FD families? Generally not.
Not in general. It definitely, we know of cases where that is true, but it's not familial in that way.
Right.
But I think you were also asking, do some of our family members also have autonomic symptoms, or as we as parents, as carriers, do we have autonomic symptoms? And we do see smatterings of that for sure.
Yeah. So years ago, I had asked some of the POTS researchers, because I had casual observation, no real science data, but I had just observed that there were a lot of Jewish young girls on our support groups, much higher than the US population, I think is about 2% Jewish. And I noticed like a lot of young Jewish girls on our support groups, they were mostly POTS patients. So I started to wonder, one copy of the FD, because to have FD, you have to have 2 copies of this gene that has a variation in it, right?
Yes, yes.
So I thought maybe 1 copy is not enough to give you full on FD, but a little milder dysautonomia. Of course, when I asked this question, I was poo-pooed and no, don't even ask that question, you know. And then several years later, there was a study out of Europe showing that 1 copy of the FD gene is actually associated with an increased risk of irritable bowel syndrome. And for years, I've been calling IBS POTS of the GI tract, because it's a disruption of function. It's you know, not the most severe GI thing in the world, but it is very unpleasant and uncomfortable for people who have it, and can be kind of quite disabling sometimes. So when that research came out in Europe, it was one of those moments where you go, I told you so. And so now I'm still pushing for researchers who study other types of dysautonomia to, I don't think this is the answer for everyone, and it doesn't necessarily mean it's the cause of anything, but I feel like it should be studied. Like, just in general, we need more genetic research in all the different types of dysautonomia, because they do often run in families, or there's a tendency, like people, myself, I have a definite autoimmune type of dysautonomia, but my aunt and my dad had very similar stuff, and so there's some, whether maybe it's the autoimmune risk factor gene that runs in my family, not a dysautonomia specific gene. But I think there's a lot of people wondering about stuff like that. So another question we have is, what is the gene? Can you maybe give us a quick genetics lesson?
It's oh gosh. Well, I know it affects ICAP, which is a protein, and I'm not remembering the number that the exon that it's on. My apologies. So no, I cannot give you a genetic lesson.
IKB-KAP, right?
Yes,
that's the protein.
Which actually has been renamed to another acronym, which is like ELP something. Its name has been updated.
Or a new name.
Yeah.
But for the folks asking, there is a very specific genetic test for this. But if you're a 17-year-old with new onset dysautonomia, or a 35-year-old who got sick with dysautonomia 2 years ago, it is very, very highly unlikely that this is what you have, because it really is something that is present from the time of birth. So I wouldn't deter you from asking for testing, but your doctor might think you're nuts if you ask, if you haven't been sick since early childhood. So just think about that, maybe learn about it more, and check out your website. Why don't you share the link for your website?
It's www.fdnow.org.
Yeah.
And there's more detailed information about the genetics piece of that as well.
Yeah. And I think that, a lot of people who have dysautonomia don't know what's causing it. And so there is a real tendency to want to get tested for everything. And I totally get it. I went through that too when I didn't have my answer. So it's, I think it is something that is important to understand, but also important to understand how it's very different from other types of dysautonomia. And most doctors are capable of at least knowing that if you have, if you're new onset in your 20s or 30s, or you've only had it for 2 or 3 years, that it's probably not FD. But, we actually do see other types of pediatric dysautonomia where the mom will say, my kid got really sick at 8 or 9, and they've been a fussy baby, and they were failure to thrive a little bit when they were, a baby. And so I actually think that probably most children who have severe dysautonomias, even if they don't have FD, that they probably do have some kind of congenital or, genetic thing that we just haven't pinpointed yet, because there hasn't been enough research on them. And I think it's in a weird, it says weird kind of say this, but almost like you're lucky that you have a gene and you have an answer, because at least it's nobody feels lucky, I guess, in having a severe genetic disorder, but that you have an answer and you have something you can treat, and that you have these researchers doing this amazing research.
There's a roadmap now.
Yeah, I want that type of research that they're doing on FD to expand, to get other researchers thinking like this. And even though it's not a miracle cure or something, are there things we can do to help the autonomic nervous system work better in other types of dysautonomia too, whether it's medication or supplements or dietary? I mean, I think most people who have an autonomic problem would go with any approach, whatever works, get me feeling better,
Exactly.
So, yeah. So do you guys have, we're gonna probably wrap up in a moment here. Do you have any sort of closing thoughts you want to share with our audience here?
You know, I think I would just like to thank you for kind of providing a platform to kind of talk about kind of this stuff, and you know, I think the more people can know about it, the more they can kind of you know, apply the info to their own kind of experience and stuff.
Agreed. Thank you so much, Lauren. This was really a pleasure. And I always say for people that are attending these things, you know, if you just learn one thing, it's worth it. So I hope that the people out there listening have learned at least one thing. I know I have, and we have more to talk about for iron, because lots of low iron in the FD world. It's talked about constantly and frequently. So, but thank you. This was really a pleasure.
Well, thank you for sharing your stories, and thank you for, you know, we're doing a great job serving the FD community and the folks that we send your way. And, you know, I think we have things we can work on together, like physician education, you know, making sure that specialists understand all the different types of dysautonomia so that they can do a good differential and figure out, you know, what's going on. So, you know, training doctors and, you know, getting media coverage to just raise awareness in general about autonomic problems, and, you know, pushing for research funding on Capitol Hill. There's so many overlaps, I think, between the different dysautonomias. So thanks so much for joining us, and happy Dysautonomia Awareness Month. Forgot to mention that October.
Thank you. Thank you.
Dysautonomia
We're
Awareness Month.
blue.
You're blue. Well, we're close. We're close. I'm in the turquoise today, but so
All right.
we didn't know that FD was blue when we started, but now we do.
Green. FD now is green, but
Green.
I know dysautonomia is blue, right?
Oh no, it's turquoise, but it's okay. Close enough. We're a colorful bunch.
Yes, wonderful.
All right.
Okay.
Well, have a great night. Thanks everybody for tuning in.
Thank you.